right? Thanking and praising God this time for, once again, sometimes we talk about the fresh perspectives that he can give us on fundamentals or seemingly old concepts. This time the concept is holiness, an extra preachy sounding word that hopefully by the time we get to the end of this chapter, Zechariah chapter 14, we will get to look at from a relatively fresh perspective in yet another chapter that for me was difficult to summarize, once again providing the opportunity for a whole lot of confusion. And for that reason, let's just first of all call the chapter holy and try to take two perspectives on the organization of the chapter, hoping that at least one of them will come through clearly. The first perspective I want to take on it is that of the day of the Lord, because it's going to start out in verse 1 talking about a day that is coming, picking that concept up again in verse 4, saying on that day, literally in verse 6 again saying on that day, likewise in verse 8 saying on that day, and in verse 9 saying on that day, and in verse 13 saying on that day. And those are just the ones I caught, but each of those descriptions of that day are going to give us a different perspective on what God is communicating about what seems to be a future time, similar, if not the same as, I guess, some of the things that we're going to see in, again, the Revelation. But with that, he is going to say that on that day, in verse 1, behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. Now, it's going to seem that he might be talking about the spoil taken from them at that time. But by the time we get to the end of the chapter, or even before we get to the end of the chapter, when he gives us a deeper description of that day, we're going to see that a lot of the things that have historically been taken from the people of Jerusalem are actually going to be returned to them by the enemies that God is assembling against them. Understanding that, he's going to go further in verse 4 to describe the way in which, even though he is bringing enemies against them, it is a day in which God is actually going to go out and fight on their behalf. That's actually verse 3, saying on that day, the events are going to create some unique things that I don't think we've seen in history, which is why I believe this points forward to the Revelation, saying that on that day, the Mount of Olives shall be split in two. And even beyond that, similar to what we see in the Revelation, the Lord is going to come with all the holy ones with him. Going on in verse 6 to say, on that day, the evening time shall be, at evening time, there shall be light. Likewise, on that day, living water shall flow out of Jerusalem, some to the eastern sea, or half to the eastern sea and half to the western sea. Verse 9 saying, on that day, he will clearly be king over all the earth, and the Lord will be one, and his name will be one. Each of those events seeming to point forward to the kinds of things we see described in the Revelation, because historically, I do not seem to understand any period of time that seems to involve these kinds of things having happened in either Jerusalem or the world for that matter. But I'm not a historian, not an expert in biblical things, but simply saying there are some correlations between the magnificent things seen here and the magnificent things the Revelation tells us, or seems to tell us, to look forward to. All my guesswork aside, though, it is going to go on to describe the way that God is going to deal with the enemies of his people on that day. But before that, in verses 10 and 11, he's going to describe the sense of security he is going to bring them, even though he has brought them through an adversity that seemed to make all the nations their enemies. Saying that not only is he going to be king over all the earth, as we saw in verse 9, never again in verse 11 is there going to be a decree of utter destruction over Jerusalem, and they shall dwell in security with, as we mentioned before, no gaps in coverage, similar to what we might look for in a dead horse illustration. Cell phone coverage that carried you all over the globe, never, ever having to wonder whether or not you're going to have a drop. Beyond that, though, verses 12 through 15 are going to give more in-depth information as to how God is going to deal with their adversaries, saying he's going to deal with them by plague, he's going to deal with them by panic, and he's going to deal with them by inner turmoil, meaning those who banded together to seemingly unjustly wage war against Jerusalem are then going to turn on one another internally and do a lot of Israel, or at least Jerusalem's work for it. Going on to say that the plague that is going to affect those assembled against Jerusalem is also going to plague their stuff in verse 15 before going on in verses 16 through the end of the chapter. I think that'll be verse 21, to describe the way that even those who were formerly assembled against Jerusalem, to the degree that God spared them and left them survivors, there is a day coming where even they will be welcomed to Jerusalem, specifically to observe the Feast of Booths. However, one of the characteristics of Jerusalem, and likewise, presumably the conduct or the character of those called there from the nations, will be the holiness. Understanding that that concept of holiness will be mentioned more than once. Understanding that verse 20 is going to say, on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord. In verse 23, on every pot in Jerusalem and Judah and every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord. Reminding us of that extra preachy word that we mentioned at the very beginning, holiness. And the perspective that we said might give us a fresh look at what it practically means for us. And it brought this to mind. In being a single guy from time to time, just as a preacher, I apologize for the degree to which I use sports analogies because not everybody is into sports. And as you are looking for a young woman or those who are married, I don't think I'm saying anything earth-shattering to say that you have to understand the things that your spouse actually cares about. And if, as a single guy, I am looking for a young lady, knowing she is not all that interested in sports, but sports are all that I talk about, after a certain period of time, that's going to get annoying. And I'm just going to become a nuisance. As an old guy, it's something we worry about from time to time. Anyway, beyond that, if I have tried to be wise with my money and I made an investment, but I find out that a company I've invested in has caused a lot of damage to the health and well-being of her family. Maybe there are some diseases they ended up getting because of some of the things that that company was involved in, then I'm going beyond a nuisance to actually becoming toxic to that young lady and the best interest of her family. Understand how that relates to the concept of holiness, in the sense that it wouldn't be very long before it was no longer a question of why was she not interested in football and happy and applauding my investments in that company, as much as it would legitimately become a question of why am I still so invested in things that are both annoying and toxic to her well-being and the well-being of people that she loves. And just as genuine affection at some point is going to move me to reconsider why I've been invested for so long in things that are actually inconsistent with her best interest, likewise, holiness is going to drive me to reconsider why I've been invested for so long in things that are actually inconsistent with the interests of God. A question with which God has seemed to confront his people at key moments throughout their history. One of them being when Joshua said, "Choose this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Likewise, in 1 Kings 18, when Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal and the people along with them. Verses 20 and 21 read, "So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, 'How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him.' And all the people did not answer him a word." Two instances that remind me of this crossroads that the people of God are confronted with at the close or nearing the close of the Old Testament. How long are they going to go on trying to reconcile God with things that are clearly against his interests? Things the Bible simply describes from time to time as unholy.